Right. Well, it's. I'm sure we're going to have other people joining us. Hang on a minute. I need to mute you all. There you go. Welcome everyone to our lecture this afternoon. We have a very young man called John, who is smiling broadly to himself, and he's going to. Oh gosh, I wish my memory was better. Sorry.
Tudor Times.
Yes, the one.
That's all right.
You see my lips move? I didn't feel them at all. There you are. He's going to do that, and we welcome you, John, and we sit back in awe of you.
Well, thank you, David, for organising today. Well, hello, everyone. Now, here's a question for you. How do you choose what books you read? My family are avid readers. My son reads about 60 books in a year, and my daughter reads almost as many. And Sandra, well, doesn't read as many as she used to, but reads enough. I'm sure my daughter, Sarah, and my wife, Sandra, feel they have a real gift from God for suggesting what books I should read. Whether it's the male resistance in me, and I suspect that it is, that I have to confess that by and large, I have failed to read the books they recommend. Having said that, before embarking on one of our latest holidays, well, that's some time ago now, my daughter, knowing I like both history and the whodunit, recommended that I read the Chard series by C.J. Sansom. The Chard series comprised of 7 books in all: Dissolution, Dark Fire, Sovereign, Revelation, Heartstone, Lamentation, and Tombland. And without a doubt, these novels bring Tudor England vividly to life. In fact, the Sunday Times said that when it comes to intriguing Tudor-based narratives, Hilary Mantel has a serious rival here. The series' protagonist is the hunchback lawyer Matthew Shardlake, who is assisted in his adventures by Mark Poirier and then by Jack Parrack. So let's settle back in our chairs, in our time machine, and let C.J. Sansom take us back to Tudor times. Why is it that we seem to be so fixated and obsessed with the Tudors? I mean, after all, the Plantagenet dynasty existed for 351 years, and the Tudors only for 118 years. Is it because their story reads almost like a tabloid newspaper? Married, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Will we ever be able to forget those gruesome lines that we learned in school? So if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. Well, would you believe it? The Welsh even plant a Welsh dragon at the heart of English history. As you are probably aware, the Tudors were originally from Wales, but were not exactly of royal stock. The dynasty began with a rather scandalous secret marriage between a royal attendant named Owain ap Meredith ap Tudor and Dowager Queen Catherine of Valois, widow of King Henry V. Now, I must put this in here. Being an Englishman, perhaps I should add that Owain was naturalized as an Englishman in May 1432. However, their grandson became King Henry VII. He and his descendants, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, and Jane Grey, if you include her 9-day reign, were all Tudor monarchs. The word is also used to describe the time when the Tudor family reigned from 1485 to 1603. On the 21st of April, 1509, Henry VII died, having suffered from gout and asthma. Following the funeral service in St. Paul's Cathedral, his body was taken to Westminster Abbey, where it was lowered into its vault. Now the days of mourning are now over. His 17-year-old son, Henry VIII, 6'4" tall, broad shoulders, red hair, and a thin, high-pitched voice, is now heir to the throne. Crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 25th of June, 1509, accompanied by his queen, 7 years his senior, Catherine of Aragon, his brother Arthur, Prince of Wales' widow, who he had married on the 11th of June, 1509, in a private ceremony in the Church of the Observant Friars outside of the Greenwich Palace. The beginning of Henry's 36 years' reign was marked with great rejoicing and expectation. Sir Thomas More, Lord Chancellor of England, English lawyer, scholar, author, and a resistance humanist whose life and death were to be inextricably linked with Henry's, commented, "The day is the end of our slavery, the fount of liberty, the end of sadness, the beginning of joy." Sadly, 26 years later, on the 6th of July, 1535, he is executed because he could not support Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn or Henry's claim to spiritual authority. As an aside, did you ever see that film called Man for All Seasons? I must confess it's one of my favorite films, and I thought Paul Scofield was outstanding as Thomas More. What did you think? Anyway, 25 years have passed since those days of great expectation. Exasperated by Catherine's failure to produce a male heir, Henry wanted to marry her maid of honor, Anne Boleyn. Pope Clement VII of Rome, refusing to dissolve his marriage to Catherine, and therefore making any grounds for divorce impossible, not to be outdone. In November 1534, Henry pushed through the Act of Supremacy, making him and all his heirs supreme head of the Church of England. The act stated, "The king shall be taken, accepted, and reputed the only supreme head of the Church of England." This meant that the Pope no longer held religious authority in England, freeing Henry to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Now the country is waking up to savage new laws, rigged trials, and the greatest network of informers ever seen. Do you think that Henry's jousting accident that occurred at a tournament in Greenwich Palace on the 24th of January, 1536, when he, being 44 years old, in full armor, was thrown from his horse, the horse itself being armored, fell on top of him and left him unconscious for 2 hours? Do you think this accident had turned Henry into a tyrannical monster, plagued by paranoia and melancholy? What do you think? Certainly, the Tudor period was a time of far-reaching change for England and its peoples. Change in religion. Henry decided what religion his subjects should adopt and issued orders from time to time telling them exactly what they should believe about religion and how they should worship. As we have already indicated, because the Pope refused to give Henry a divorce, he severed his relationship with Rome, making himself head of the church, changing the national religion from Catholicism to Protestantism. And if you chose the wrong religion and voice your conviction for all to hear, you could well up being burned at the stake or had your head chopped off. Not a very pleasant prospect. There were also changes in English governance. Henry and Cromwell reconfigured the power of Parliament, reorganized central and local government, creating the first modern nation state, run by the first real government bureaucracy. The increasing role of Parliament involved instituting administrative reforms, taming the Scottish border, the Welsh marches, and Ireland. Wales itself was a tangled web of jurisdictions between the south and the west, ruled by the king's behalf by the marcher lords. North Wales was ruled by the king's son, the Prince of Wales. But as you already know, in 1536, Henry didn't have a son. Worse, the Welsh resented the English interlopers. So Cromwell engineered an Act of Union in 1536 that included the abolition of the Principality and the marcher lords, imposing the English system of shires, sheriffs, JPs, and so on, abolishing Welsh law in favor of English, allowing only English to be spoken in the courts, and fourthly, eliminating any distinction between English and Welsh subjects. So there were changes in governance. There were also social changes too in the structures of society. Henry VIII believed he could maximize the country's wealth, or his wealth, by confiscating the church's assets. Thomas Cromwell devised a plan to confiscate the wealth of the monasteries. The trouble was that their dissolution caused immense social problems. You see, it was the poor and the ordinary people who suffered greatly as a result of this policy, because it was the monasteries that had provided schools, hospitals, that had dealt with social problems and aid for the poor. This made many, many people very unhappy and angry, so much so that Henry faced a very serious rebellion in 1536 called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which he crushed with severe brutality. Cromwell's solution to this problem is that he issued what was called the Poor Law in 1536. This authorized local authorities to raise funds for the deserving poor, that being the sick, widows, children, and others. This was the first step towards a system of public welfare in Europe. Whilst it is true that most of the population lived in small villages and made a living from farming, towns began to grow larger and more important. During the 16th century, trade and industry grew rapidly in England, becoming more and more a commercial country. The mining of coal, of tin, and lead flourished, as did the iron industry. As England grew more and more prosperous, life for the well-off became much more comfortable. The upper classes and middle class people benefit from the growing wealth of the country. Although trade and agriculture continued to flourish and the country prospered, this society still had to face some harsh realities. Tudor England was rife with contagious diseases and regular epidemics such as dysentery, tuberculosis, and influenza swept through the country. Although they killed off the rich and poor alike, the malnourished masses, due to the poor harvests and famine, were less able to fight off infection and were more prone to death by disease. Those who lived to their 40th birthday were considered to have arrived at a nice old age. The Tudor diet was tied to the seasons. People preserved as much food as possible for the hard months that followed the harvest by drying meat, storing grain, and making cheese. The poor were at a risk of starvation always following a bad harvest. So here's my question. What would it have been like to have lived under Henry VIII's Tudor reign? Do you remember the Tudor bard William Shakespeare's famous line from As You Like It? All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. It seems that Shakespeare saw life as an act of 7 stages. But let's look at 3 particular aspects of Tudor life in this lecture: childhood, men and women, and then public health. The first aspect then, childhood. Life in Tudor England was really hard, and you had to be tough and fortunate to survive. you know that was 14% of children died before their first birthday? 25% rather died before their 5th birthday, and as many as 40% died before their 16th birthday. When you were born, you would be washed with warm water, rubbed with butter or rose oil to keep you warm, and then you'll be wrapped in cloths like bandages. Then, after a few days, you would be baptized, because the risk of dying was so high in infancy. As you can imagine, women had a shorter life expectancy than men due to the risk posed by childbirth. The next big stage in your development as a child would be your education. Now, I know that we have a number of our members who are retired school teachers. I wonder how you would have liked to have taught in Tudor schools. Tudor education, well, although the lawyer, scholar, and Chancellor Sir Thomas More famously taught his daughters a fine education, most Tudor parents were less enlightened. Not many children went to school in Tudor times. Those who did were mainly the sons of the wealthy or working families who could afford to pay the attendance fee. There were 2 types of school: the petty school, where young children were taught to read, and then the grammar school, where boys were taught in Latin. Boys were educated for work and began school at the age of 4 and moved to the grammar school at the age of 7. Whereas the wealthiest families hired a tutor to teach their boys at home. Girls were educated for marriage and running a household. So they were either kept at home by their parents to help with the housework or sent out to work to bring money in for their family. Children attended school 6 days a week. The school day commenced at 7 a.m. in the winter and 6 a.m. in the summer and finished around 5 o'clock in the evening. At school, pupils often had to speak in Latin. They were taught Greek, religion, and mathematics. The boys practiced writing in ink by copying the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. There were very few books at this time, so pupils read from horn books instead. These were kind of wooden boards that had the alphabet, prayers, and other writings pinned to them, and they were covered with a thin layer of transparent cow's horn. Teachers were extremely strict. If children misbehaved, they were beaten with the birches. That was a type of cane. As many as 50 strokes. So pupils very often too scared to go to school because of the beatings. Pupils from wealthy families could often afford a special friend called a whipping boy. When the rich child was naughty, yes, you've guessed it, it was the whipping boy who received the punishment instead. It's worth noting at this time that by the start of the 16th century, that many schools were accepting girls along with their male peers. Even the poorest girls in Norwich in 1560s went to school. That's childhood. Now let's look at the second aspect of Tudor life. Now I'm sure there's much more I could have said about that, but let's look at this issue of men and women in society. Tudor society was divided into 4 main groups of men. From the various diaries and books written during this time, we can see that society had these 4 divisions. The first group were the nobility. They were at the top of the pile and owned huge amounts of land. The second group were the gentlemen. They were the gentry, rich merchants owning large amounts of land. They were usually educated, had a family coat of arms, and did no manual work whatsoever. The third group were the yeomen and craftsmen. They could be as wealthy as gentlemen, in fact. They were able to read and write, but unlike the gentlemen, they did the work alongside of the men themselves. The fourth group were the poor. They were usually illiterate, farm workers, servants, and vagrants who had neither voice nor authority. It was very hard for the poor to afford things since the cost of living kept going up and up. Life got much harder when there was a bad harvest or when disease or plague struck. there was often not enough jobs because population was growing so fast that during Elizabeth I's reign in 1563, she empowered the justices of the peace to raise compulsory funds for the relief of the poor. The poor were put into different categories. Those who would work but could not work, they lived in their own homes but could not find a job. They were given food and clothes or given work in return for a wage. Those who could work but would not work, these were called the lazy poor. They were punished by publicly parading them through the streets, whipping them as they went until they had learned the errors of their ways. Not a practice to adopt today, I don't think. Those who are too old or ill or young to work were looked after in the almshouses, hospitals, orphanages, or poorhouses. Now, the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 offered help to the able-bodied poor. They were set to work in a house of industry. Materials were to be provided for them so they could do the job. However, the idle, lazy poor and vagrants were sent to the house of correction or prison. Pauper children, these were poor children who received charity and probably would become apprentices. The people who were unable to work due to disability, illness, or old age were looked after either in almshouses, hospitals, poorhouses, or in their own home. What do we make, what do we know about Tudor women? The Tudor dynasty is famous for its women, namely the 6 wives of Henry VIII, the equally unfortunate Jane Grey, and the sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who wore the crown. And at this point, am I allowed to squeeze in Bess of Hardwick in here? She was a noble figure of Elizabethan English society. By a series of well-made marriages, she rose to the highest levels of English nobility and became enormously wealthy. But what was life really like for those lower down the social scale? What was like for the ordinary woman in Tudor period? They couldn't vote or hold public office, were barred from attending grammar schools and universities, and could not be on the stage as actors because men played the role of women in their plays. Women were clearly regarded by everyone as being subordinate to men, but were accorded a place of some importance and honor in society. Their husbands were expected to treat them kindly and with respect. We can form some idea of the attitude of Tudor men towards women by the conduct of characters in Shakespeare's plays. Now, I know that this is not an entirely reliable guide, but his characters had to be believable and acceptable to his audience. Shakespeare's women had strong personalities and great determination. I think that some Welsh women are a bit like that too. Whether they are playfully mischievous women, like Mistress Page in Merry Wives of Windsor, or the admirable, virtuous women like Desdemona in Othello and Cordelia in King Lear, or even women like Lady Macbeth, or like women who showed great professional expertise, like Portia, the lawyer in The Merchant of Venice, or Helen, the physician in All's Well That Ends Well, and Viola, the diplomat in Twelfth Night. In 1523, Sir Anthony Fitzherbert, a judge of the Crown of Common Pleas, wrote a best-selling practical handbook for farmers entitled The Book of Husbandry. This book contains advice on various aspects of farming. What I found of most particular interest was what he had to say about the role of the farmer's wife. Listen to what he says. She must clean the house, feed the calves, prepare the milk, wake and dress the children, prepare her husband's breakfast and dinner and supper, and supervise the servants. She must make butter and cheese, feed the pigs morning and evening, and have a care for the hens, ducks, and geese and collect their eggs. She should put her husband's sheep to good use by making clothes from their wool, and she should know how to make hay, to winnow all kinds of corn, to make malt, and to help her husband to fill the muck wain or dung cart. She should also be able to go to market if her husband is unable to go himself, and know how to buy and sell shrewdly at market. It's important that on these matters, she should give a true account to her husband of all money she has spent and received at the market, and her husband should do the same to her. For many marriages have been wrecked because husbands and wives conceal money matters from each other. I found that rather amusing. I don't know what you thought of that. Although married women in Shakespeare's plays are strong and determined, they do not defy their husband's authority over them. The only two who attempted to do so are Catherine in The Taming of the Shrew and Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And they are evidently reduced to submission by the punishments which their husbands most probably inflicted on them. Certainly one of the ironies of the subordinate position of women in Tudor society was not affected by the fact that England had been ruled for 44 years by a woman, Elizabeth I. The fact that only 5% of women could read and write by the end of the 16th century gives you some insight as to the status of women generally. Finally, what about marriage? A good marriage during Tudor era was one which brought prosperity to the family of the bride and the groom. For the groom, it might be a good dowry, and for the bride, advancement in status or invaluable connections for her family. The emotions of the couple involved were not really considered. They might never have met until they stood before the altar. In fact, the higher up the social class, the less likely a person was to have a choice in their spouse. And they tended to marry very young, and many of the marriages were political matches. For example, Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old when she married her second husband, Edmund Tudor, aged 24, on the 1st of November, 1455, the minimum age for a full marriage recognized by the church. But Margaret's first marriage was reputed to have been between the 26th of January and the 7th of February, 1444, to John de la Pole when she was a year old, but certainly no more than 3 years old, a marriage which was dissolved in 1453. Some say the marriage never happened, and then it just was a betrothal. Margaret, when she did marry the Tudor, she had one child and she named him Henry. He was Henry VII. At the age of 13, she gave birth to him on the 28th of January, 1457 in Pembroke Castle. His father, Edmund Tudor, died of the plague while she was a prisoner in Carmarthen Castle on the 3rd of November, 1456. Now, we all know since March, COVID-19 has certainly helped focus our minds on keeping well and keeping safe. We'll not easily forget public health mantra, hands, face, and space. And that brings me to the third and final aspect of Tudor life, which is public health. I have alluded already to the fact that Tudor England was rife with contagious diseases and regular epidemics of dysentery, tuberculosis, and influenza. They swept through the country. The unsanitary conditions of the streets were considered an important factor in plague epidemics, and rules for cleaning the streets were embodied in the plague laws, or the plague orders. These were published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London in 1665. These orders required householders to clean the streets outside their homes every day and insist that burials only take place at night with neither family nor friends being present. In fact, for many years, there had been a statute that anyone throwing dung or offal into the streets would be fined 40 shillings, a considerable sum in those days. And there's abundant evidence that this was enforced. At first, the task of sweeping the streets was left to the householder, but later it became a municipal function where men were hired by the town and city for this purpose. One of the most feared sicknesses was the sweating sickness, a mystery summer illness that could dispose of its victims within 24 hours. Now, I know we have this picture of Henry VIII painted of someone who was very strident, self-confident, but you know, he's one of the most or perhaps the greatest hypochondriac ever to sit on the English throne. Maybe it was because of the death of his brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, almost 16 years of age, in April 1502, from some mysterious illness. Maybe it was the sweating sickness that turned Henry into such a hypochondriac. Little wonder that as soon as the king heard about the latest outbreak of the dreaded sweat in the summer of 1528, he ordered that the court be immediately broken up. And he took off on a flight from safe house to safe house in different parts of the country. Sufferers apparently died with the sweating sickness. Anne Boleyn survived the condition, but Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, lost his wife and daughters to the sweating sickness. Finally, then, let me say a brief word about food, drink, and entertainment in Tudor times. I hope you're still with me. You haven't nodded off just yet. If you are enjoying good sleep, well done. The poor living in cities survived on bread made from flour in mills alive with rats, and pies were filled with spiced meats to disguise the fact that the meats were very often off. Those living in the country had more of a choice because they could make bread from the wheat grown in the fields and fresh meat from hares and rabbits that they were able to catch. Meat was a luxury, but poor people sometimes kept animals to provide milk, cheese, and eggs. Both rich and poor ate fish, which was packed in barrels of salt to stop the fish going rotten. Honey was used instead of sugar to sweeten desserts, such as fruit pies. Water was far too polluted to drink, so the poor drank small beer. That was ale that was watered down, while the rich drank from wine and sherry. As far as entertainment was concerned, the rich enjoyed musicians to play music on flutes and lutes whilst they ate. There were always popular tunes for dancing. Dances were lively, with many moves and turns, spirals and jumps. The recreation for the poor people included singing, bowling, cockfighting, dancing. Living during Henry VIII's reign, it was an act of treason to predict the king's death. The day before Henry died, he saw his confessor and received Holy Communion. Although death was obviously imminent, not even Henry's doctor had the courage to break the news to the king that he was going to die, because after all, it was treason to predict the king's death. But on Friday, the 28th of January, 1547, the man who had started his reign as a virtuous prince died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years of age. As this brings down the curtain on Henry VIII's life, so does the curtain fall on my lecture. Oh, and by the way, what book will you be reading next? And who will choose it for you? Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was absolutely wonderful. If I could invite you all to unmute yourselves, because I don't have the power to do that unanimously, then we could start asking John some questions. So, any questions?
Or anything to add?
Yes.
Yeah.
You got one.
Right. The person who's got their hand up with the telephone number.
Maddie, me.
Mary, yeah.
Mary, yes, Mary.
Can I ask a question?
You can,
Yes.
Mary, yes.
Oh, thank you. Yes, a very informative lecture. I really enjoyed it. However, right at the beginning, I just wondered about one thing that you did mention. You said that the House of Tudor of Wales was not of royal blood. However, Rhys ap Tudor, a descendant of Hywel, was king of Deheubarth, made king in 1079.
Yes.
And this was recognised by King William of Hastings. He was recognised as King of Deheubarth. Now, Deheubarth actually very relevant to us because we live in Deheubarth because it consists of the kingdoms of Ceredigion, Ystrad Towy and Dyfed. So it's as well for us to remember this. He was of royal blood, Rhys ap Tudor.
Yeah, you're quite right, Mary. I was referring to it as far as England was concerned. As far as England
yes,
was
well,
concerned,
as I say, King William did acknowledge him as being of royal blood.
Yes, I accept that fact. Okay, I accept that fact. Yeah. Yeah.
But a very interesting lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Anyone else?
I was interested that even in those days there was social care provided for the poor in the form of support for the poor people and almshouses. I hadn't realised that they were given such assistance that long ago.
Yeah. That was the first, really, in Europe of a welfare state.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So presumably that was paid for by the raising of taxes.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Still the same today.
Yes.
John, I think you were saying that when they were eating food,
Yes,
it would often be heavily spiced meat because the meat was off. Was that for the gentry, was it? Was that for the...
no, that was mainly for the poor.
Queens?
For the poor. Because
Oh,
don't forget that by and large, life was lived in the villages. But then as industry began to flourish, then the towns became enlarged and industry began to flourish. And so the poor people, they couldn't afford luxuries that the wealthy people could. So they had to get by what they could.
So were the spices being imported?
Yeah, yes. And also they grew their own.
Yes.
I thought the approach, looking at women, I found very, very interesting, especially that bit about the farmer's wife.
Yes.
What's
Margaret,
changed?
Margaret, did you want to say something?
Well,
Margaret Davis?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. With all that said that the farmer's wife was expected to do, how on earth did the farmers manage to find wives? If that's what they were expected to do, all that.
Yes.
Not women would want to go into that.
I think when you got to the age of 40, how you were considered to be old.
Yes.
That's quite sad, isn't it? You know, when you think how things have developed since then.
Yeah.
I think children nowadays think that we're old at 40, so.
Yeah.
Any other questions at all?
No,
No.
it was very good, very well put together.
Very well, very interesting.
Very well put together.
Yes,
Mm.
really full picture.
I think one of the observations I would make about Tudor Times was whenever I was watching Henry VIII and his 6 wives on television, it always amazed me how they used to turn up and always there used to be food on the table, as it were. But just occasionally in some of them, it'd be a case of, well, we thought we'd stay the night, and you could almost see people rolling their eyes thinking we haven't got anything cooked. And it must have taken hours to prepare the sumptuous banquet in order to feed the king and his entourage when they came to drop in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got to hand it to them on grand cooking scale.
Yeah.
I thought the Pilgrimage of Grace was interesting. You know how that it was a very severe challenge to Henry VIII's government. I know they hated Cromwell, and they hated the change of religion because by and large they were still Catholic in their thinking, and for the king to try and change it, it was a great revolt from the Pilgrimage of Grace. I thought that was quite interesting, and how the way Henry dealt with it, he just crushed it.
It'd be interesting to know as to what would have happened if King Henry VIII hadn't decided to put himself as head of the church, as to whether we'd still be a predominantly Roman Catholic country.
I think we would, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Or if Catherine of Aragon had been able to have a male child that lived.
Yeah.
Because he was married to her for 20 years. Yeah. Someone's got their hand up.
Yeah, that's Mary. She hasn't popped it down yet.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I apologise.
What would it be like to be a teacher in those days? I think I would have tried to get a whipping boy.
Well, was it at that time that printing presses were forbidden?
But, yeah, because of the seditious literature that was being printed.
Yes, because you said about books being written on, or word being written on cow horn. Yes.
Okay, if all comments and questions have now ceased, I'd like to thank you, John, for your most interesting talk.
Okay, thank you.
A number of things I had not realised, and thank you for some of the things that you have reminded me about.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Dave. You're doing the next one, aren't you, David?
I'm doing the next one. I'm doing it on Romero's El Salvador. So a little bit, excuse me, a little bit about Oscar Romero, who became Archbishop of El Salvador. And also, I'm going to show you part of the trip that I took there in the year March 2000, around the time of, I think it was the 20th anniversary of Archbishop Romero's assassination. So I'll be showing you pictures because I'm a picture-orientated person, and I'll be talking over them because, well, you'll get tired of looking at me. So that's in a fortnight's time, and in a little while, hopefully either into the day or tomorrow, I will be putting up a recording of this afternoon's lecture onto our YouTube channel.